Bruce Rosenblum. Bruce is a longtime leader in the world of articles, systems, and particularly the world of electronic publishing. He is a longtime friend of NISO, having been responsible for a number of projects within NISO, particularly the NLM-DTD, which is now the NISO JATS standard, and a variety of other work. He is also a NISO Fellow, having received the honor in 2020. Currently with Adapon. Bruce, you are up, and I can see you. I think I can hear you. Do you have slides?
I do. Let me share my screen. Get the slides going. There we go. Okay.
And there you
Thank you very much,
Great.
Todd and Jill, for the invitation. And good afternoon, everyone. This is the point where if we were meeting in person, I would look across the room and say, it's nice to see a few familiar faces in the audience. And at this point, all I can do is look at the list of attendees and say, it's nice to see a few familiar attendees on the list. So thank you all for coming today. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges in citing preprints and how to tackle them. It's one thing to get a preprint up and posted, but then when people start building new science on top of that, as the famous saying goes, standing on the shoulders of giants, people need to they need to cite preprints, especially if a version of record article has not yet been published. A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes about from last year. Again, as with everyone else, COVID-19 created an explosion of preprints, and we discovered very quickly in working with a number of publishers that created an explosion of citations in new preprints to previously posted preprints. And that posting is basically moving faster than peer review and publishing. And so we went about revising our software in particular to be able to handle citations to preprints better. And what we thought would be a 1-month project turned out to be a 3-month project, because the more we started looking around, the more we started discovering challenges. So what made those challenges so big? The first is that we discovered that preprint servers don't always identify their content as preprints. So I was listening to Katie a minute ago thinking it's wonderful that NIH has 1 or even 2 banners being very clear that content is preprint content, but that's not always the case. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that recommended citations on preprint servers may be incomplete compared to the data that we feel needs to be there. And so that then when authors go and cite preprints, either the recommended citation is incomplete, or if they download data to a citation manager, it doesn't know how to handle preprints properly. And so the new citations that appear in new preprints are often incomplete. And finally, incomplete metadata makes citation completion and verification challenging. So I want to walk through these in a little bit more detail. The first is that preprint servers don't always identify content as not peer reviewed. So ideally what we want is the kind of notification that bioRxiv has up on their preprint server, that these are preliminary reports that have not been peer reviewed. On the other hand, sometimes we see something like MindArchive, where all it says is not affiliated with other preprint servers, and that's the only mention of the word preprint. But there is nowhere on this site any mention that anything they've posted is actually not peer reviewed. It may not be final publication. I want to bounce out from the slides for a second, show you something I actually stumbled on this weekend that sort of reinforces the same point. I've been an avid reader of National Geographic for years. I get almost daily newsletters from them at this point. And under their science heading, I think it was last Tuesday, Zoom fatigue may be with us for years. Here's how we'll cope. And I start reading this, and I think this is interesting, especially when I get to the second paragraph and it says, new research published today. So I click on the link, and it brings me to this page on SSRN. And I start looking at this, I say, oh, interesting. let me look at this. And I go and I download the PDF. And, I live my life in Microsoft Word. And to me, that it's very obvious that this is actually not a published branded journal article. It's a preprint that's a PDF made directly from the Microsoft Word manuscript. But if I come back and take a look all over this page, nowhere do I find any kind of a warning that this is a preprint, that this has not been peer reviewed. So if I come back to the original second paragraph, it says new research published today. That's actually not a fair description of what it is. This is new information that has been posted but not yet peer reviewed. Actually wrote to the author of this article, Teresa McKemmer, over the weekend. I have yet to hear back from her. So this is the kind of challenge we can run into if in fact we are putting up content on sites and not clearly indicating that it's peer reviewed. And I bet there are a lot of people who read that article last week in National Geographic and a few who clicked through and did not realize that what they were looking at was not yet peer reviewed content. And that article did get picked up, that preprint, by a number of other news organizations. And so it creates a challenge in making sure that journalists also understand how to discuss material that may not yet be peer reviewed. And so in the slide, I just have, this is what the recommended citation is at SSRN. Again, is this a preprint? How can we tell? We can't. You have to be a sophisticated, knowledgeable reader to know that SSRN does maintain some preprints, but not exclusively so. So then we run into recommended citations on preprint servers. There is a wonderful preprint that's an outcome, I believe, of last year's NISO meeting on preprints a year ago, February. And you'll notice that author number 3 is Katie Funk, who just spoke before me. And this is hosted on OSF Preprints. So we went up and we thought, well, we wanted to cite this in another work that we were working on. And so we said, well, let's try to put it together in APA format and MLA format and Chicago format. And you'll notice that in the APA format, it doesn't even list OSF preprints as the preprint server. So clearly there's something wrong here, but more broadly, none of these recommended citations say that it is explicitly a preprint. Now, yes, OSF preprints might indicate that, but that's the name of the server. There's no indication in the citation itself that it's a preprint. So if it's coming from Authoria, and you're not a knowledgeable reader as to what Authoria is, you don't know that it's a preprint unless that's built into the citation. So one of our recommendations, we believe that the fact that it's a preprint should be built into a citation. I also want to just point out the MLA citation for a second that points out that yes, it's on the web, but it doesn't give either a link or a DOI. So on the previous slide, the APA and Chicago citations provided a DOI, so you've got a firm link to exactly where that preprint is. But the MLA citation did not even provide a DOI. And one of the things we're actually seeing, MLA style aside, is a lot of times when authors cite preprints in new papers, they don't include a DOI when they are citing that preprint. These are some examples that we've discovered in the real world where preprint citations just simply didn't have a DOI. This one is from bioRxiv. It makes it clear, although it doesn't say it's a preprint. This one's from medRxiv, although again, it doesn't state that it's a preprint. This one's also missing the year. So our recommendations for preprint citations, and we'd love to see all the major style guides do appropriate updates. All the journals that don't follow major style guides do updates. We'd love to see updates in reference managers such as EndNote, Zotero, and so on, and author instructions as well. Is that when you're citing a preprint, it's required you have at least the first author, the date that it's posted, the preprint title, the name of the preprint server, some sort of an indicator that it's a preprint, and finally the DOI for that preprint. So this is an example of what we consider a good preprint citation. This is from the AMA Manual of Style. You can see we have the authors, we have the title of the preprint, we have the name of the preprint server, We have then preprint posted online with the full date of posting, and then we have the DOI. So this is really important to make sure that preprints end up being cited correctly. Coming back to something that we've already talked about earlier with both Alberto and Katie, is that when we have a preprint, the title may change between the initial submission by the author. So here we have a submission to the Bulletin of the World Health Organization preprint server that went up early a year ago, March. A simple model to assess Wuhan lockdown effect, etc. And then the final title, when it was published in a journal, modeling the effects of Wuhan's lockdown during COVID-19, China. Now, Katie, you sort of bypassed the question, and I understand why, in terms of whether or not titles should stay static. The problem with requiring titles to stay static is that the author may not have come up with a good title for the paper, or one that really is clearly describing the content in the most clear and succinct way possible when they come up with their original title. So publishers need the ability to modify the title as necessary when a paper is published in a journal. The challenge is then that we need better systems, and this is an area for which I don't have an answer, so that when the article is published in a journal, we then have a way to go back and make sure that all the records are updated if the title doesn't match. So again, that's something that we need to put some better minds on, that to try to figure out what the best way is to make those connections automatically, or at least automatically enough that there can be a quick human review that can then go ahead and make the correct tie. Another problem that we ran into is quite often, as I mentioned, citations come in without DOIs. And so one of the things we've been doing is automatically looking up DOIs on Crossref. One of the things we've discovered, unfortunately, is that Crossref is inconsistent when you do the same query. So in this case, we literally took the same reference and we queried Crossref 2 times, 2 seconds apart. And in the first one, we got no DOI back. And in the second one, we did get a DOI. So be forewarned that if you're trying to look up DOIs on Crossref when authors haven't provided them, you do need to be patient and maybe query 2 or 3 times, because sometimes you may not get a DOI back even though there is one. And this is something we've reported to Crossref, and they are working on, but we don't have any timeline for when it will be fixed. Another challenge you'll run into is sometimes authors will post preprints to more than one preprint server. So again, here's a preprint that ended up a year ago on 3 different preprint servers, on SSRN, on the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, and then on medRxiv. And these all showed up within 2 weeks of each other. Now, in some cases, it may be because the preprint has been submitted to a journal and the author has been given an option to automatically make a preprint available. So we're pretty sure, not 100%, but we're pretty sure that this particular preprint, the first one on SSRN, ended up because the author submitted this to the Lancet. And then it was automatically turned into a preprint on SSRN. The second one was definitely a direct author submission to the Bulletin of the World Health Organization. Now, this happened about 2 weeks after the SSRN preprint. So it's unclear to us if the article had been rejected from the Lancet and then put up on the Bulletin of the World Health Organization. And then also halfway in between those two, it also went up on medRxiv. And so one of the things we're seeing is, for various reasons, possibly because of authors submitting to multiple journals, or possibly because authors want their research disseminated as widely as possible, we are getting essentially the exact same preprint with 3 different DOIs on 3 different preprint servers. I'm not going to argue in favor or against this, but it is something that you do need to be aware of, that it is happening out in the real world. This, fortunately, is not something, this next one is not something we tend to see on the well-established preprint sites, but we are seeing in a small number of cases, preprint sites are going ahead and replacing preprint with the posted article of record. So here is something, medRxiv, which is about marine science, where they had a preprint posted with a DOI, But if you actually follow that DOI and go back to MAR Archive now, you get actually the article on PLOS One. So they have literally taken down the preprint and replaced it with the article of record. That, in my view, is completely inappropriate because there may be significant differences between the preprint and the article of record, and you need to make sure that both are available. So if somebody had cited the preprint, someone later reading the article with that citation can see exactly what the scientist or the author had been reading and not speculate that, gee, I'm now looking at the PLOS One version and what may be different between the preprint and the original posting. Finally, there are at least a small number of preprints that are withdrawn. BioArchive and medRxiv are very good about handling this in terms of making it clear on their site that the paper, that the preprint has been withdrawn. Unfortunately, there is not a way in Crossref today to indicate the withdrawn status of a preprint in Crossref metadata. So again, this is something we've talked to Crossref about, they're aware of it, but what this means is that there is no automated way to go and discover in the metadata if a preprint's been withdrawn, short of going to every single preprint site, using their APIs and starting to discover when preprints are withdrawn. But that's simply not scalable. Whereas Crossref provides a single API where we can get this. So we'd love to see this information available at Crossref so we can get it with a single API call. It is possible to get this metadata from Retraction Watch. They actually maintain, at this point, probably the most comprehensive database of withdrawals, retractions, and so on. But that is, again, not available with an API. It's data that you would have to license from. So finally, our recommendations for preprints are, first of all, identify that content is not peer-reviewed at all stages of the workflow. And sort of extending this idea out a little bit, there's actually an old NISO recommended practice called PyJ, which gives recommendations for the essential information to have on journal websites to indicate what the journal is. So things like making sure you've got the journal name and ISSN. I'd love to see a comparable recommended practice for preprints. What are the minimum pieces of information that need to appear on a preprint site? For example, that the material is a preprint, has not been peer reviewed yet. Second of all, update all citation styles to include any and all recommended elements. So it's clear when you're citing a preprint that you in fact are citing a preprint, not peer reviewed literature. Third, integrate metadata and common workflows to ensure, first of all, the preprints are treated as a unique type. So if you're doing XML, they should not be treated as an article. They should be treated as a preprint. And this means in the reference list, if you're citing a preprint, follow the JATS for our recommendations and make sure that the citation type is preprint, not journal article. Make sure that if you're maintaining a preprint server that you promptly update information about publication status when you have that. Never, never, never replace a preprint with a published version of the article on a preprint site, and never deposit preprints to Crossref as journal articles. This is what had to be done up until about 3 or 4 years ago. There are still some preprint servers that have not updated and are still depositing preprints as journal articles. The metadata is different. Follow the Crossref recommendation on that. And finally, as we've discussed several times today, we need to update systems so that they can link articles, publish articles with preprints more effectively, particularly if we're in the situation that the title has changed. And we also need better systems for identifying withdrawn preprints. My slides, which will be available from NISO, do have some recommended reading. I highly recommend the second paper in particular, the Beck et al. That includes Katie Funk as one of the co-authors. There are some great recommendations in that. So thank you very much. I'm happy to address any questions.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. One quick question for clarification. You were talking about our recommendations. I'm wondering who our and the we is in that regard.
Sorry, and the recommendations I made earlier in the slides with respect, let me just quickly get back there. with respect to what should be in a preprint citation. So recommendations for preprint citations, both what's in our slide and is mimicked in the AMA manual style. So sorry if I wasn't clear.
Sure, okay. In response, I should note, there was a conversation at the NISO Plus conference about the idea. I think you were in that session. I think this might have been your idea around retractions and developing a guidelines for how to describe retractions. The NISO, so for the context, for those of you who were not at NISO Plus, not everyone was, one of the things that we want to do with NISO Plus is foster conversations and then drive work out of those conversations. And the NISO leadership has decided that this idea, addressing the idea of retractions, is something that we as a community should look into. And this is one of the projects that we will are going to be exploring in the first round of NISO Plus outputs. So with that bit of context, Bruce, do you want to give people some ideas about what you had in mind?
Yeah, first of all, I want to make sure that we scope it appropriately. What I definitely don't want to get into is policies behind whether or not information should be retracted and what the workflow is for that. What I want to focus on initially is just the fact that I don't even think we have good standards in terms of web presentation for if an item has been retracted or if an item has been withdrawn. What is the content that should go up on the site where the original article is? And if there's a separate retraction notice, as has been typical with journal articles, what the content should be there, how far it should go in describing things, but at a minimum, just making sure that it's clear that something has been retracted. And as part of that, I'd also love to see, again, what are the expected reporting requirements with metadata? If you look at Retraction Watch, they have a very large number of items that aren't indexed in either PubMed or in Crossref in terms of retracted items. And there's a breakdown in the system if they are independently tracking a lot of these things, but they are not being tracked as I believe they should in a service like Crossref or PubMed. So it's really a matter of describing what are the responsibilities once an item has been withdrawn or retracted as to exactly what needs to happen in terms of web presentation and metadata handling. So that's what I'd like to see as a starting point, and then perhaps there may be need to expand it. But again, staying away from the policy issues, I think COPE covers a lot of that well, and I'm not sure that's something for NISO to dive into, but at least once it's done, make it clear.
Yeah, that's a really great point and an interesting, an angle that the leadership of NISO has called out as one of the most interesting ideas coming out of the conference that we can advance and advance quickly. So. I'm wondering, there was another issue that you had mentioned, and Katie had brought this up in her talk, having to do with changing titles. And I'm sure, I think you raise a good point that, part of the value of putting up early stage research or early stage outputs is you're still working on it. You still have different ideas. I'm wondering if there's a pattern matching possibility. I think Katie mentioned this as well, of the title might have changed, but the abstract didn't. Or if it did, it was very minor in its changes. I'm wondering if there's a sort of fuzzy matching that could take place that isn't title, it's abstract authors.
I think it's actually a very cool idea. Certainly not anything that I had thought of. And Katie, I think it's a great idea. And maybe, I don't know if there's anyone from Crossref listening, but maybe that's something that Crossref could look at, is starting to use additional metadata for cases where the title has significantly changed to try to come up with that match between the title, between the preprint and the journal article publication.
Mhm.
So that would be something certainly for Crossref to look at, and maybe others who are trying to solve this same matching problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a serious problem in our community. How do we link up the different manifestations? You know, they're not exactly new works. They're very related. How do we link up all of these things? Because, and it gets to this issue of retractions. In order to say that this was retracted for whatever reason, um, this other related thing needs to be retracted as well.
Right. So, for example, again, I'm putting back up this withdrawn preprint from bioRxiv. I suspect that this one never got to the point of being a journal article. In fact, this was, as I recall, a pretty controversial paper, well commented on in the mass media. Yeah, if you have a preprint that is withdrawn after the journal article has been published, that has even larger problems. Although ideally, we would catch that as an issue in peer review. So you're right that tying all this together as we have more and more manifestations of a given work item will become tougher and tougher over time. And that's something that creating those linkages in a way that is robust with appropriate fuzzy matching is going to, I think, create some very interesting challenges.
Yeah. I was related to that. I was interested to hear your recommendation that the original version of the preprint shouldn't be replaced. Uh, because I would think, and again, this is something of a philosophical question, that if you consider a preprint a work in progress, wouldn't you want to point to the final output, not the, um, you know, half, whatever way, unfinished project?
From the preprint site, you definitely want to point to the final published version. No question of that. And again, medRxiv, bioRxiv do that very well, particularly when the Crossref data has made the match. What you don't want to do is make the original preprint completely disappear, because again, if there was a significant difference between the content of the preprint and the content of the final published version, and somebody cited the preprint, a later researcher can't go back and see exactly what was cited by the original author. That's the challenge. Or what the research was in the preprint that might be different from the published version. So it's a matter of making sure that if you cite something, that artifact never goes away. You always want to be able to go back and look at the version cited so you understand the chain of research.
I mean, I certainly understand and value your perspective there. I'm just, oh. There's another question here.
Again, Todd, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a link to the PLOS One article on the
Final.
page. We absolutely should have that 100%. What I'm saying is we shouldn't make the original preprint go away in case there's a significant scientific difference between the preprint and the final, and somebody had in fact cited the science of the preprint, not the science of the final.
Yeah.
That's my issue, is you're making some science go away that might have a significant difference.
Yeah, it's fair. A question from one of the attendees, or more of a comment: would multiple resolutions of the preprint and subsequent versions help address this?
Well, again, so long as all the versions are kept up, and I think a lot of preprint sites are good about this, that helps address the problem. My beef isn't with multiple versions of preprints and then having a final article. It's strictly with a preprint server taking down the preprint and making it go away. So if somebody had cited that, you can't see the actual science that they had cited. So there could be 5 versions on a preprint site, and that's great, and they should all be kept up.
Yeah, I think that's I think the appropriateness, the importance there is not just the DOIs, but the metadata associated with the DOIs so that people can
Right.
make an informed decision about what they're looking at.
Yes. Always let
The
people be able to make an informed decision. And we could go back to the earlier conversation about um, what is informed research, because that in and of itself has challenges in terms of people reading things carefully and understanding what they're reading. And sometimes it's very, very hard to discern what is good science and what is not. Um, I've run into this a lot of places where I actually read an article really carefully. And I say, wait a second, you've just run a clinical trial, and I'm giving a real world example here. You've just run what you're purporting to call a clinical trial with 10 patients on treatment and 10 on placebo. And one of the patients on treatment died of a heart attack, but you're not recording that as an adverse event. And yes, there are real articles like that. So you have to learn how to read for things like that.
yeah. One more comment related to DOIs. There's a presumption there that um, every version of a preprint needs a distinct DOI.
Not necessarily. Some people do advocate having one DOI, recording all the versions at the landing page for that DOI, and then putting a version indicator in the citation, or as I indicated earlier, let me see if I can quickly get back to that slide. If you put the date of posting, that is also implicitly a, here we go. If you have the date of posting of that version, that implicitly states the version that was posted. Whether or not it's necessary to mint a DOI for each version, that gets into other challenges, because then if you try to link to Crossref, say the DOI hasn't been included in the citation, as I showed in several of these other citations, say the DOI hasn't been included, you go to look it up. If you start hitting multiple DOIs on Crossref, you may end up with nothing rather than something. So there are arguments both in favor and against minting a new DOI for each version. And I'm not going to come down, I'm not going to take sides on that.
Sure. Well, and I think you're presuming a robust content management system that retains those previous versions, which many preprint servers have, but
I believe
you
it
have,
would be imprudent for a preprint server to not have that if they allow versioning.
yeah, fair point. Okay, well, we have actually run a little long, but we've run into a brief break that we have. So, Bruce, I want to thank you so much. Fantastic talk. Particularly enjoyed highlighting some of the real life, real world examples here of some of these issues that we're facing.